Captain Sarah Chen adjusted her flight suit for the third time that morning, her fingers working the familiar motions while her mind wandered through the endless paperwork waiting on her desk. At 28, she had become the unofficial administrator of the 325th Fighter Wing at Tyndall Air Force Base, Florida. Her colleagues knew her as the quiet one who handled logistics, coordinated training schedules, and somehow always managed to have the right forms ready when the brass came calling. What they didn't know was that Sarah Chen had logged more flight hours in combat simulators than any pilot on the base. What they couldn't see was the way her eyes tracked every aircraft that took off and landed, calculating wind speed, approach angles, and fuel consumption with the precision of a master craftsman watching an apprentice work. What they never suspected was that the woman who organized their coffee runs and managed their equipment requisitions could outfly most of them blindfolded. The morning briefing room buzzed with the usual chatter as pilots filtered in, their conversation mixing complaints about the Florida humidity with boasts about weekend conquests. Colonel Marcus Webb stood at the front of the room, his weathered face showing the strain of managing one of the most prestigious fighter wings in the Air Force. The 325th was responsible for training the next generation of F-22 Raptor pilots, and every day brought new challenges. "Gentlemen," Colonel Webb began, then caught himself as Sarah entered the room with her ever-present clipboard. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a situation developing." Major Rick Hammer Morrison leaned back in his chair, his confidence filling the small space around him. At 35, he was the wing's top instructor, known for his aggressive flying style and his ability to push trainees to their limits. His record was impressive, his attitude was insufferable, and his opinion of female pilots was barely concealed behind military courtesy. "What's the word, Colonel?" Hammer asked, his tone suggesting he already had the answer to whatever problem had emerged. Sarah took her usual seat in the back corner, pen poised over her notepad. She had learned years ago that invisible was often the best way to be useful. While other pilots fought for attention and recognition, she gathered information, observed patterns, and prepared for opportunities that might never come. "We've got a high-priority training exercise coming up," Colonel Webb continued. "Pentagon wants to test our newest pilots against some unconventional scenarios. They're sending a team of observers, including some folks from the Joint Chiefs. This is our chance to showcase what the 325th can do." Lieutenant Dave "Rookie" Patterson raised his hand tentatively. Fresh from flight school, he still carried the eager nervousness of someone trying to prove himself worthy of the F-22 cockpit. "Sir, what kind of unconventional scenarios?" The colonel's smile was grim. "The kind that separate the good pilots from the great ones. Electronic warfare, multiple threat environments, contested airspace with limited support. They want to see how our people perform when everything goes wrong at once." Sarah made careful notes, but her mind was already racing through tactical possibilities. Electronic warfare meant jamming and spoofing, which required pilots to rely on instincts rather than instruments. Multiple threats demanded split-second decision-making and perfect situational awareness. It was exactly the kind of challenge she had been preparing for in countless hours of simulator time that no one knew about. "I'll need volunteers for this exercise," Colonel Webb announced. 8 pilots total, 4 experienced instructors, and 4 advanced trainees. The instructors will fly opposing force, trying to shoot down the trainees. The trainees will attempt to complete a strike mission while defending against superior numbers. Hammer's hand shot up immediately. "Count me in, sir. I'd love to show these Pentagon observers what real flying looks like." 3 other instructors quickly volunteered, their confidence evident in their quick responses. The selection of trainees took longer, as Colonel Webb considered the relative skills and experience levels of his available pilots. Sarah continued taking notes, calculating fuel loads and maintenance schedules that would be needed for the exercise. "Patterson, you're in," the colonel decided. Martinez, Williams, and Thompson as well. That gives us our 8. Lieutenant Jennifer Ghost Martinez nodded grimly. She was one of only 3 female pilots in the wing, and she felt the constant pressure to outperform her male counterparts. Captain Bobby Ace Williams was a former Navy pilot who had transitioned to Air Force after a carrier landing accident. Major Tom Thunder Thompson rounded out the group, a veteran with more combat hours than anyone except the colonel himself. As the briefing continued with technical details and safety protocols, Sarah found herself studying the dynamics at play. Hammer and his fellow instructors were supremely confident, perhaps overconfident. They had been flying F-22s for years and had never met a trainee they couldn't outfly. The selected trainees were skilled, but they were also predictable. They followed doctrine, executed textbook maneuvers, and rarely deviated from established patterns. "Chen," Colonel Webb called, startling Sarah from her observations. "I'll need you to coordinate all the logistics for this exercise. Fuel, maintenance, observer facilities, the whole 9 yards." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied automatically, even as her heart sank slightly. Once again, she would be watching from the ground while others took to the sky. After the briefing, Sarah walked across the tarmac toward the maintenance hangars. The morning sun was already brutal, promising another scorching Florida day. F-22 Raptors sat in neat rows, their angular stealth design making them look like sleeping predators. Each aircraft represented the pinnacle of American air superiority technology, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 2 and carrying enough firepower to engage multiple targets simultaneously. Sarah paused beside one of the aircraft, running her hand along its heat-resistant coating. She knew every system, every component, every capability of the Raptor. She had studied technical manuals that most pilots never bothered to read, memorized performance characteristics across every possible flight condition, and understood the aircraft's limitations as well as its strengths. "Dreaming about flying, Chen?" Hammer's voice cut through her reverie like a rusty blade. Sarah turned to find the Major approaching with his characteristic swagger. His flight suit was perfectly pressed, his hair perfectly styled, and his attitude perfectly obnoxious. "Just checking the maintenance schedule, sir," Sarah replied evenly. Hammer laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. "You know, I've been thinking about our conversation last month. You mentioned you had some flight experience before joining the logistics track." "Some," Sarah admitted carefully. She had learned not to volunteer information around Hammer. He had a talent for twisting any admission into ammunition for later mockery. "What was it again? Crop dusting? Flight instruction for weekend warriors?" His tone made it clear he considered either option barely worthy of acknowledgement. "Charter flights mostly," Sarah said, which was technically true, though it left out some important details. Right. Well, stick to what you know, Chen. These birds aren't cargo planes. They require real pilots." Hammer patted the F-22's wing condescendingly. "Wouldn't want you to get any ideas about joining the exercise. Could be dangerous for someone without proper training." Sarah nodded politely, her expression revealing nothing of the fire building behind her eyes. "Of course, sir. I understand my role." As Hammer walked away, Sarah returned her attention to the aircraft. Her fingers traced the edges of the cockpit canopy, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine sliding into the pilot's seat, feeling the tremendous power of twin engines responding to her commands. Experiencing the pure freedom of three-dimensional movement that only flight could provide. Her phone buzzed with a text message, pulling her back to reality. Maintenance schedules, fuel calculations, and observer accommodations awaited. Sarah walked toward the operations building, her mind already organizing the 100 details that would need to be managed for the upcoming exercise. Inside the operations center, she began the familiar process of coordinating a complex training mission. Phone calls to fuel suppliers, emails to maintenance chiefs, and requisitions for additional equipment filled her afternoon. It was work she could do with half her attention, leaving her mind free to analyze the tactical situation that would develop during the exercise. The instructors would have every advantage. They knew the trainees' capabilities and tendencies. They would choose tactics designed to exploit weaknesses and force mistakes. The trainees, despite their skill, would be reacting rather than initiating, unless something unexpected happened to change the dynamic. That evening, Sarah remained at the operations center long after her official duties ended. She pulled up the pilot personnel files on her computer, studying performance records and training scores. Hammer was indeed skilled, with reflexes and spatial awareness that placed him in the top tier of military pilots. But his files also showed a pattern of predictable tactics and a tendency to underestimate opponents he considered inferior. The other instructors had similar profiles. Excellent pilots, but comfortable in their superiority and perhaps too reliant on conventional approaches. The trainees were competent, but lacked experience in truly challenging situations. It would be a massacre unless something shifted the balance. Sarah closed the files and leaned back in her chair. Outside, the flight line was quiet except for the distant sounds of maintenance crews working through the night. F-22s required extensive maintenance between flights, and the crew chiefs took pride in keeping their aircraft in perfect condition. Her computer chimed with an incoming email from Colonel Webb. The exercise schedule had been moved up by 2 days due to the observers' availability. What had been a comfortable week of preparation was now a frantic scramble to arrange everything by Thursday morning. Sarah began updating her coordination timeline, but her mind kept drifting to tactical considerations. The exercise parameters called for a simulated strike mission against a heavily defended target. The trainees would have to penetrate air defenses, avoid interceptors, and deliver their ordnance on target. Meanwhile, the instructors would be hunting them with no restrictions except safety protocols. It was a scenario designed to teach humility, not build confidence. The Pentagon observers would see exactly what they expected: experienced instructors demonstrating the futility of sending inadequately prepared pilots against superior opposition. It was a valuable lesson, but not necessarily the message the Air Force wanted to send to its senior leadership. As midnight approached, Sarah finally gathered her papers and prepared to leave. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only a few security vehicles making their rounds. She walked slowly to her car, enjoying the relative cool of the night air. Tomorrow would bring another day of logistics coordination and administrative tasks. The day after would see the exercise begin, with her watching from the control room while others took to the sky. It was the role she had accepted when she chose the logistics track, but sometimes the choice felt more like a trap. Sarah started her car and drove toward the base housing complex where she maintained a small apartment. The radio played softly, mixing country music with late-night talk shows, but she barely heard it. Her mind was still in the cockpit of an F-22, visualizing maneuvers and tactics that she would never have the opportunity to execute. The next morning brought chaos, as the compressed timeline forced everyone to work at maximum efficiency. Sarah coordinated with maintenance crews, arranged briefing rooms, and ensured that fuel trucks would be positioned properly for rapid turnaround between flights. By noon, she had consumed 4 cups of coffee and fielded 37 phone calls. Colonel Webb found her in the maintenance hangar, reviewing checklists with the crew chief. "How are we looking, Chen?" he asked, his voice showing the strain of the accelerated schedule. "Everything's on track, sir," Sarah replied, consulting her ever-present clipboard. "Fuel delivery is confirmed for 600 tomorrow. Maintenance has 8 aircraft ready for flight status. Observer facilities are prepared in the tower and control room." The colonel nodded approvingly. "What about pilot briefings?" "Scheduled for 0700, sir. Weather looks good, with unlimited visibility and light winds." "Outstanding. I knew I could count on you." Webb paused, studying Sarah's face. "You know, I've been thinking about your background. Your file mentions some civilian flight experience. How much time do you actually have in high-performance aircraft? Sarah hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Enough to understand what the pilots are dealing with, sir. That's not really an answer, Captain. No, sir. It's not. Sarah met his eyes directly. But it's the one I'm comfortable giving. Colonel Webb studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. Fair enough. Just make sure everything goes smoothly tomorrow. We can't afford any problems with the Pentagon watching. As Webb walked away, Sarah returned to her coordination duties. But his question lingered in her mind. Her flight experience was considerably more extensive than her file indicated, but she had learned years ago that some information was better kept private. The Air Force had a complicated relationship with pilots who didn't follow traditional career paths, and her particular background might raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. The rest of the day passed in a blur of final preparations. By evening, every detail was confirmed, every contingency planned for, and every piece of equipment positioned exactly where it needed to be. Sarah finally allowed herself a moment of satisfaction as she reviewed her checklists one final time. Tomorrow, 8 pilots would take to the sky in the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. 4 instructors would demonstrate the superiority of experience over enthusiasm. 4 trainees would learn valuable lessons about the realities of air combat. Pentagon observers would witness a carefully orchestrated display of Air Force capabilities. And Sarah Chen would watch from the ground, her own capabilities hidden behind a clipboard and a logistics coordinator's uniform, her potential constrained by choices made years earlier and circumstances that no one at Tyndall Air Force Base could possibly understand. The stage was set for a demonstration that would unfold exactly as everyone expected. What no one suspected was that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one you never see coming. The alarm clock's harsh buzzing cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 500, but Sarah Chen was already awake. She had spent most of the night reviewing flight parameters and weather data, her mind running through scenarios that she would only observe from the ground. The exercise that would determine how the Pentagon viewed the 325th Fighter Wing's capabilities was now just hours away. Sarah dressed quickly in her utility uniform and drove through the empty streets of Tyndall Air Force Base. Security lights cast long shadows across the flight line, where maintenance crews were already conducting final preparations on 8 F-22 Raptors. Each aircraft represented over $150 million of cutting-edge technology, and today they would be pushed to their limits in simulated combat. The fuel trucks arrived precisely on schedule, their drivers maneuvering with practiced efficiency between the aircraft. Sarah coordinated the refueling process from her position near the operations building, her radio crackling with updates from crew chiefs and maintenance supervisors. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. At Oro 6:30, the Pentagon observers arrived in a small convoy of black SUVs. General Patricia Hawkins emerged from the lead vehicle, her 3 stars catching the morning light. She was accompanied by 2 colonels and a civilian analyst whose presence suggested this exercise carried implications beyond routine training evaluation. Sarah watched from a respectful distance as Colonel Webb greeted the observation team and escorted them toward the tower. "Chen!" Colonel Webb called as the group passed. "These are our observers from Washington. General Hawkins, this is Captain Chen, our logistics coordinator. She's the one who made today's exercise possible." General Hawkins extended her hand with a firm grip and sharp eyes that seemed to evaluate everything around her. "Captain, I understand you've coordinated some complex operations here." "Yes, ma'am." "We're ready for whatever the day brings," Sarah replied, maintaining military bearing while feeling oddly exposed under the general's scrutiny. "Excellent. I'm looking forward to seeing what your pilots can do under pressure." The general's tone suggested she had specific expectations about the outcome. As the observers continued toward the tower, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that General Hawkins had been studying her more intently than a simple logistics coordinator would normally warrant. But there was no time to analyze the interaction further, as her radio erupted with reports from the flight line. The pilots began arriving at 0645, their flight suits bearing the names and call signs that would soon fill the air above the Gulf of Mexico. Hammer Morrison strutted across the tarmac with his characteristic confidence, already visualizing the victories he would score against the trainees. Ghost Martinez walked with more reserved determination, her jaw set in the expression of someone carrying extra weight on her shoulders. Rookie Patterson looked nervous despite his efforts to appear calm. Ace Williams maintained the steady composure of a veteran who had seen real combat. Thunder Thompson moved with the measured pace of someone conserving energy for the challenges ahead. The four instructor pilots displayed varying degrees of casual arrogance, secure in their expectation of easy victory. The pilot briefing began promptly at 0700 in the Operations Center's main conference room. Sarah positioned herself at a side table, ostensibly managing paperwork, while actually absorbing every detail of the tactical discussion. Colonel Webb outlined the exercise parameters with military precision. The scenario is a time-sensitive strike against a high-value target deep in contested airspace. Intelligence indicates heavy surface-to-air missile coverage and enemy fighter patrols. Your mission is to penetrate the defenses, deliver ordnance on target, and return to base. He gestured toward a large screen displaying the exercise area over the Gulf of Mexico. Red Force will be represented by our four instructor pilots, flying as enemy interceptors. Blue Force consists of our four trainees attempting to complete the strike mission. Red Force objectives are simple. Prevent Blue Force from reaching the target. Hammer raised his hand with a slight smirk. Sir, what are the engagement parameters? Full envelope? Within safety constraints, yes. This is as close to real combat as we can make it in a training environment. Webb's expression was serious. I want to see maximum effort from both sides. The observers are here to evaluate our capabilities, not watch a choreographed demonstration. Sarah made notes while listening to the tactical details. The target was positioned 200 nautical miles southeast of the base, requiring the Blue Force aircraft to fly through a corridor heavily patrolled by Red Force. Electronic warfare systems would simulate enemy jamming, forcing pilots to rely on basic instruments and visual navigation. It was a scenario designed to overwhelm inexperienced pilots. The weather briefing followed, delivered by a young meteorologist who seemed intimidated by the presence of Pentagon observers. Conditions were nearly perfect, with unlimited visibility, light winds, and no precipitation expected. Whatever happened in the exercise would be determined by pilot skill rather than environmental factors. As the briefing concluded, Sarah noticed subtle tensions between the pilots. Hammer made a comment about separating the real pilots from the pretenders, earning dark looks from the trainees. Ghost Martinez's response was barely audible, but clearly profane. Thunder Thompson simply smiled, his combat experience giving him confidence that simulator hours couldn't match. The pilots dispersed to conduct individual aircraft inspections and final preparations. Sarah moved to the control room where she would monitor the exercise from her logistics perspective, tracking fuel consumption and coordinating any maintenance issues that might arise. The room was crowded with observers, controllers, and safety personnel, all focused on the large displays showing aircraft positions and status information. At 0800 precisely, the first F-22 engines began their characteristic whine as pilots completed their startup procedures. Sarah watched through the control room windows as heat distortion shimmered behind each aircraft, the twin Pratt & Whitney engines generating over 35,000 pounds of thrust each. The sound built to a crescendo that could be felt as much as heard. Hammer's voice crackled over the radio first. Tower, Viper 1 ready for taxi. Viper 1, Taxi to runway 27, wind 270 at 8 knots. The 4 Red Force aircraft taxied in sequence, their angular shapes looking predatory even on the ground. They were followed by the Blue Force flights, the pilots' voices betraying varying levels of tension as they prepared for what would essentially be aerial combat against superior opponents. Sarah found herself gripping her pen tightly as she watched the aircraft line up for takeoff. 8 pilots were about to engage in the most challenging flying of their careers, and she would experience it entirely through radio chatter and radar displays. Tower, Viper 1 ready for departure. Viper 1 cleared for takeoff. Contact departure control on 124.7. Hammer's F-22 accelerated down the runway with devastating power, its engines leaving twin trails of heat distortion in the morning air. The aircraft lifted off smoothly and climbed at an angle that seemed to defy physics, disappearing into the clear sky within seconds. The remaining aircraft departed at 30-second intervals, their departure times carefully coordinated to provide tactical separation. Within 5 minutes, 8 of America's most advanced fighter aircraft were airborne and heading toward a confrontation that would test every aspect of their pilots' training. Sarah monitored fuel consumption calculations while listening to the radio traffic. The aircraft were climbing to their assigned altitudes and proceeding toward the exercise area. For the next hour, she would track their progress through data displays and pilot communications, her role limited to ensuring logistical support was available if needed. Blue Force. This is Control. Exercise commences in 60 seconds. All safety protocols remain in effect. The control room grew quiet as everyone focused on the developing scenario. On the main display, 8 aircraft symbols moved across a map of the Gulf of Mexico, converging on an area where simulated combat would determine the reputation of the 325th Fighter Wing. Hammer's voice came through clearly, his confidence evident even over the radio. Red Force in position. Let's show these kids how it's done. Ghost Martinez responded for Blue Force, her voice tight but controlled. Blue Force acknowledges. Beginning approach to target area. Sarah found herself holding her breath as the exercise officially began. The first few minutes would be crucial, as both sides maneuvered for tactical advantage. Red Force would attempt to engage Blue Force before they could reach their target. Blue Force would try to avoid or defeat the interceptors while maintaining their mission timeline. The radio exploded with activity as the engagement developed. Pilots called out contacts, missile launches, and evasive maneuvers in the rapid-fire communication of aerial combat. Sarah tracked the action through radar displays, but the technical readouts couldn't convey the intensity of 8 pilots pushing their aircraft and themselves to the absolute limit. Blue 3, missile inbound from your 6 o'clock. Blue 3 defending, deploying chaff and flare. Red 2, I have a shot on Blue Leader. Blue Leader notching right, going defensive. The engagement was proceeding exactly as expected. Red Force used their experience and superior positioning to systematically engage the Blue Force aircraft. Within minutes, Rookie Patterson was declared shot down by simulated missile fire, his voice frustrated as he reported his elimination from the exercise. Sarah watched Patterson's aircraft symbol disappear from the tactical display, leaving 3 Blue Force pilots to continue the mission against 4 aggressive opponents. The odds were becoming increasingly impossible, just as the exercise designers had intended. Blue 2 is hit! Ace Williams's voice carried the disappointment of a veteran who had expected to perform better. Going down! General Hawkins leaned forward in her observation chair, studying the tactical display with professional interest. Proceeding as expected, she murmured to one of her colonels. The instructors are demonstrating clear superiority. Sarah bit her tongue to keep from pointing out that the exercise was designed to guarantee that outcome. The instructors had every advantage: better positioning, superior numbers, and intimate knowledge of their opponent's capabilities. It was less a test of skill than a demonstration of institutional hierarchy. Ghost Martinez and Thunder Thompson continued toward their target, using every evasive technique in their repertoire to avoid the Red Force aircraft hunting them. Their communication became increasingly urgent as Hammer and his fellow instructors closed the tactical net around them. "Control, Blue Leader. We're getting hammered out here. Electronic warfare is degrading our navigation systems." Sarah noticed something in Ghost Martinez's voice that others might have missed. Beneath the stress and tactical focus was a note of genuine fear. The young pilot was discovering that simulated combat could feel uncomfortably real when experienced in the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor. The exercise continued for another 20 minutes, with Red Force systematically eliminating the remaining Blue Force aircraft. Thunder Thompson lasted longer than expected, using his combat experience to extend the engagement, but eventually succumbed to coordinated attacks from 2 Red Force pilots. "Exercise terminated," came the announcement from control. "All aircraft returned to base. Red Force victorious with complete mission denial." The radio chatter shifted to post-exercise communications as pilots began their return flights to Tyndall. Hammer's voice carried obvious satisfaction as he requested priority landing clearance, while the defeated Blue Force pilots maintained professional communications despite their disappointment. General Hawkins turned to Colonel Webb with an expression that was difficult to read. "Interesting exercise, Colonel. Your instructors certainly demonstrated their capabilities." "Thank you, ma'am. The 325th takes pride in maintaining the highest training standards." Sarah continued monitoring the returning aircraft while listening to the observers' conversation. Something in General Hawkins's tone suggested the exercise had confirmed expectations that weren't entirely positive for the Air Force. One of the Pentagon colonels consulted his notes before speaking. "The performance gap between instructors and trainees seems quite significant. Are we adequately preparing our new pilots for real-world threats?" Colonel Webb's response was careful. "Today's exercise represented an extremely challenging scenario, sir. Our trainees performed within expected parameters against superior opposition." Sarah realized that the exercise, designed to showcase Air Force capabilities, had instead highlighted potential weaknesses in pilot preparation. The observers had witnessed exactly what they might have feared, that even highly trained pilots could be overwhelmed by sophisticated opponents. The aircraft began landing at 5-minute intervals, their pilots taxiing to designated parking spots with the subdued movements of people processing a difficult experience. Sarah coordinated post-flight fuel servicing and maintenance inspections, but her attention remained focused on the conversations occurring in the observation area. "General," Colonel Webb said carefully, "I hope you understand that today's scenario was intentionally challenging. Our training program produces exceptionally capable pilots." General Hawkins nodded slowly. "I'm sure it does, Colonel. But I'm also sure our enemies won't be concerned with fair fights or appropriate challenge levels." The criticism was subtle but unmistakable. The exercise that was meant to demonstrate Air Force excellence had instead raised questions about combat readiness and training effectiveness. Sarah watched Colonel Webb's expression tighten as he processed the implications. The post-flight debriefing began an hour later, with all 8 pilots gathered in the same conference room where the day had started. The mood was considerably different now, with the trainees showing the deflation of comprehensive defeat and the instructors displaying satisfied professionalism. Hammer led the tactical review with obvious enjoyment. "The key lesson here is the importance of experience and proper positioning. Blue Force made several critical errors that allowed Red Force to control the engagement from the outset." His analysis was technically accurate, but delivered with a condescending tone that made the trainees' failure seem inevitable rather than educational. Sarah watched Ghost Martinez's jaw clench as Hammer detailed her tactical mistakes with unnecessary specificity. The electronic warfare environment clearly overwhelmed Blue Force. Hammer continued. Navigation errors led to predictable flight paths, making intercepts routine for experienced pilots. Thunder Thompson spoke up quietly. The jamming was more extensive than we expected based on the briefing parameters. Real combat won't conform to briefing parameters, Major, Hammer replied dismissively. Adaptability separates competent pilots from exceptional ones. Sarah found herself increasingly irritated by Hammer's attitude, but she maintained her silent observer role while taking careful notes. The debriefing was supposed to be educational, not an opportunity for humiliation. General Hawkins asked pointed questions about specific tactical decisions and training methodologies. Her inquiries suggested she was building a comprehensive assessment of the 325th's capabilities and limitations. Colonel Webb answered as diplomatically as possible, but the underlying message was clear. The exercise had not produced the demonstration he had hoped for. As the debriefing concluded, Sarah began coordinating the logistics for aircraft maintenance and fuel replenishment. Tomorrow would bring routine training flights, but today's exercise would be analyzed and discussed for weeks to come. The Pentagon observers would return to Washington with detailed reports about what they had witnessed. Walking across the flight line as the sun reached its afternoon peak, Sarah reflected on the day's events. 8 skilled pilots had flown 8 sophisticated aircraft in a carefully designed exercise that had produced exactly the results everyone expected. The instructors had won because the system was designed to ensure their victory. The trainees had lost because they were placed in an impossible situation. But as she reviewed her notes from the tactical communications, Sarah began to notice patterns that others had missed. The electronic warfare simulation had been more aggressive than specified in the briefing. The Red Force positioning had been optimized beyond normal parameters. Someone had wanted this particular outcome, and they had adjusted the exercise variables to guarantee it. Her phone rang as she reached the operations building. Colonel Webb's voice was tight with controlled frustration. "Chen, I need you in my office immediately. We have a situation developing." Sarah quickened her pace, wondering what new challenge the day would bring. The exercise was over, the observers were preparing to depart, and the normal rhythm of base operations should have been resuming. But Colonel Webb's tone suggested that the day's complications were far from finished. As she climbed the stairs to the colonel's office, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The carefully orchestrated demonstration had revealed more than anyone intended, and the consequences were about to become clear. What had started as a routine training exercise was evolving into something much more significant. The door to Colonel Webb's office stood open, and Sarah could see him pacing behind his desk with the phone pressed to his ear. His conversation was brief and intense, ending just as she reached the doorway. "Sir, you wanted to see me? Come in and close the door, Chen. We need to talk." Sarah entered the office and took the offered chair, her clipboard balanced on her lap out of habit. Colonel Webb remained standing, his expression showing the strain of whatever conversation had just concluded. "The Pentagon observers weren't entirely satisfied with today's exercise," he began carefully. "General Hawkins has requested additional demonstrations of our capabilities." "Additional demonstrations, sir. She wants to see how our pilots perform under different parameters. Tomorrow morning, we're going to repeat the exercise with modified conditions." Sarah felt a chill of apprehension. "What kind of modifications, Colonel?" Webb's smile was grim. "The kind that are going to test everything we think we know about our people and our capabilities." The emergency call came at 5:45 the next morning, shattering Sarah Chen's restless sleep with its urgent electronic shriek. She fumbled for her phone, recognizing the base emergency number before she was fully awake. "Captain Chen, this is Master Sergeant Rodriguez at the command post. Colonel Webb needs you at operations immediately. We have a code yellow situation developing." Sarah was already reaching for her uniform as she responded. "What's the nature of the emergency, Sergeant?" Ma'am, I'm not authorized to discuss details over the phone. The colonel said to tell you it's related to today's demonstration flight. 20 minutes later, Sarah rushed through the doors of the operations center to find organized chaos. Technical personnel were clustered around multiple computer terminals, their voices creating a buzz of urgent communication. Colonel Webb stood in the center of the activity, his hair disheveled and his expression grim. General Hawkins was beside him, still wearing yesterday's uniform, suggesting she had never left the base. "Chen, thank God you're here," Colonel Webb called as she approached. "We have a serious problem." Sarah's mind immediately went to worst-case scenarios. "Aircraft emergency, sir?" "Worse. We've lost 4 pilots to food poisoning from last night's dinner at the base club, including Hammer and Thompson. The base hospital has them under observation, but none of them are flight qualified for at least 48 hours. The implications hit Sarah immediately. Today's modified exercise was supposed to restore confidence in the 325th's capabilities after yesterday's disappointing performance. Without half the planned pilots, the demonstration would have to be canceled or significantly altered. "Sir, what about the other qualified pilots on the base?" General Hawkins stepped forward, her expression showing the strain of an impossible situation. "Captain, we've explored every option. The other qualified F-22 pilots are either on leave, attending training courses off base, or medically grounded for routine issues. We have exactly 4 pilots available, and we need 8 for the exercise parameters." Sarah felt a strange mixture of dread and anticipation building in her chest. "What are you asking me to do, ma'am?" Colonel Webb exchanged a look with General Hawkins before responding. "Chen, your personnel file shows civilian flight experience. How much high-performance time do you actually have?" The question Sarah had been dreading for years had finally arrived at the worst possible moment. She took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. "Approximately 2,800 hours in various military aircraft, sir, including 400 hours in F-22 simulators and 150 hours of actual flight time in the Raptor." The silence that followed her statement was deafening. Colonel Webb stared at her with an expression of complete bewilderment, while General Hawkins leaned forward with sudden interest. "Captain," the general said slowly, "your official record shows no F-22 flight time and minimal high-performance aircraft experience." "That's correct, ma'am. My actual flight history is somewhat more complicated than my current assignment would suggest." Colonel Webb found his voice. "Chen, what the hell are you talking about? You're a logistics coordinator. You've been handling paperwork and fuel schedules for 2 years. Sarah nodded, her decision made. "Yes, sir. But before that, I was Lieutenant Sarah Chen, F-22 pilot with the 1st Fighter Wing at Langley Air Force Base. I flew combat missions over Afghanistan and completed advanced tactical training at Nellis Air Force Base." The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. General Hawkins studied Sarah with new intensity, while Colonel Webb struggled to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about one of his personnel. "Why isn't this in your file?" General Hawkins demanded. "Because I requested transfer to a non-flying position after an incident that wasn't officially my fault, but left me questioning my place in a cockpit, ma'am. The Air Force was happy to accommodate my request, especially since they needed experienced people in logistics roles." Sarah's mind flashed back to that day over Afghanistan 3 years earlier. Engine failure at 30,000 feet, hydraulics compromised, navigation systems failing. She had managed to save her aircraft and complete the mission, but the emergency had rattled her confidence in ways that wouldn't heal. The suggestion to transfer to a ground position had seemed like a solution rather than a retreat. Colonel Webb was checking his computer terminal frantically. "Jesus, Chen, I'm looking at classified records now. You're not just qualified on the F-22, you're one of the highest-rated pilots who's ever flown the aircraft. Your simulator scores are off the charts." "Yes, sir. I've maintained proficiency through regular simulator sessions, though I haven't flown an actual aircraft in over 2 years. General Hawkins stepped closer, her expression intense. Captain, we need to modify today's exercise anyway. What if instead of the original 8 versus 8 scenario, we run a single F-22 against multiple opponents, one pilot demonstrating exceptional capability against overwhelming odds? The implication was clear, and Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate. Ma'am, are you asking me to fly? I'm asking if you think you can handle 4 opponents simultaneously while completing a complex mission profile, because that's what we need to salvage this demonstration. Sarah looked around the operations center at the faces watching her. Technical personnel had stopped their work to observe the conversation. Colonel Webb appeared simultaneously hopeful and terrified. General Hawkins waited with the patience of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions quickly. General, with respect, that scenario is tactically impossible. No single pilot, regardless of skill level, can defeat 4 competent opponents in the same aircraft type. What if the opponents weren't flying F-22s? Sarah paused, processing the implications. What would they be flying, ma'am? F-16 Fighting Falcons. 4 experienced pilots in aircraft they know intimately, with instructions to prevent you from completing your mission by any means necessary. The tactical situation became clear in Sarah's mind. 4 F-16s against 1 F-22 was still overwhelming odds, but the F-22's stealth and sensor capabilities might make the scenario possible. If the pilot was exceptional, if everything went perfectly, if luck favored the desperate. Ma'am, I'd need to know the specific mission parameters, weapons loadout, and engagement rules before I could give you an assessment. General Hawkins smiled for the first time since Sarah had arrived. Colonel Webb, let's get Captain Chen briefed on the scenario and get her into a flight suit. The next hour passed in a blur of technical briefings and equipment preparation. The modified exercise called for Sarah to penetrate a defended zone, deliver simulated ordnance on a time-sensitive target, and return to base while being hunted by 4 F-16s flown by pilots borrowed from the nearby 53rd Wing. The F-16 pilots were experienced aggressor pilots, trained specifically to replicate enemy tactics against superior opponents. Sarah found herself in the pilot equipment room, pulling on a flight suit that felt both familiar and foreign after 2 years away from the cockpit. The equipment fitted perfectly, but the psychological weight of returning to flight status was more complex than she had anticipated. Chief Master Sergeant Williams, the senior enlisted pilot equipment specialist, helped her with the final adjustments. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, why did you leave flying for logistics work? Sometimes the hardest thing about being a pilot isn't the flying, Chief, it's everything else. Williams nodded with understanding. Yes, ma'am. But sometimes you have to get back in the cockpit to remember why you loved it in the first place. The walk to the aircraft felt like approaching a reunion with an old friend who might not remember you. Sarah's assigned F-22 sat in perfect condition, its maintenance crew having worked through the night to ensure optimal performance. The crew chief, Technical Sergeant Martinez, greeted her with professional efficiency. Ma'am, aircraft 064108 is ready for flight. All systems checked, fuel load optimized for extended range, and countermeasures loaded per your specifications. Sarah conducted her pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision of someone who understood that attention to detail meant survival. Every surface, every system, every component received careful scrutiny. The aircraft was flawless, a testament to the maintenance crew's professionalism. Settling into the cockpit felt like coming home. The F-22's controls were exactly where her muscle memory expected them to be, and the heads-up display came to life with familiar symbology. Sarah ran through her pre-flight checklist, her hands moving automatically through procedures that she had performed hundreds of times. Tower. Phantom 1 ready for taxi. Phantom 1, taxi to runway 18, wind 180 at 6 knots. The F-22 responded to her touch like a perfectly tuned instrument, its twin engines providing smooth power as she maneuvered toward the departure runway. Radio chatter filled her headphones with updates from the 4 F-16 pilots already airborne and waiting in the exercise area. Phantom 1, you are cleared for takeoff. Contact departure control on 124.9. Good luck out there. Sarah advanced the throttles smoothly, feeling 70,000 pounds of thrust pressing her back into the ejection seat. The F-22 accelerated with brutal efficiency, its advanced engines providing more power than most pilots ever experienced. Rotation speed came quickly, and suddenly she was airborne again for the first time in over 2 years. The climb to altitude gave Sarah time to reacquaint herself with the sensations of high-performance flight. The F-22 responded to her inputs with precision that bordered on telepathic, its fly-by-wire flight controls translating her intentions into perfect aerodynamic execution. Every system functioned flawlessly, providing her with unprecedented situational awareness. Control. Phantom 1 passing through 20,000 feet. Proceeding to exercise area. Phantom 1, control copies. Hostile aircraft are positioned at your 12 o'clock, range 60 miles, various altitudes. Exercise commences when you enter the 30-mile ring. Sarah activated her radar and immediately detected the 4 F-16s positioned to intercept her. Their formation showed professional tactical spacing, with 2 aircraft high and 2 low, blocking the most direct approach to her target. The pilots flying those aircraft were experienced professionals who understood how to maximize their numerical advantage. But they were flying F-16s against an F-22, and they had no idea who was flying the Raptor. Sarah descended to 500 feet above the Gulf of Mexico, using the water's radar-reflecting properties to mask her approach. The F-22's stealth characteristics made it nearly invisible to enemy sensors, but she needed every advantage available against 4 determined opponents. Control. Bandit Group is repositioning. They're spreading out to cover more area. Phantom 1 copies. Continue mission as planned. The first intercept attempt came from her left flank, as one of the F-16 pilots attempted a high-speed slash attack. Sarah detected the approach through her advanced sensors and maneuvered to avoid engagement while maintaining course toward her target. The F-16 pilot never acquired a radar lock, passing harmlessly behind her position. Control! Bandit 1 missed his intercept. Phantom 1 continuing. The second attack was more coordinated, with 2 F-16s attempting a pincer movement designed to force her into range of the remaining aircraft. Sarah responded by climbing rapidly and performing a series of defensive maneuvers that used the F-22's superior energy management to avoid engagement while maintaining mission timing. 20 miles from target, the 4 F-16s regrouped for a coordinated assault. Sarah realized that conventional evasion would no longer be sufficient. She needed to eliminate at least some of the opposition to complete her mission successfully. Control, Phantom 1 is engaging hostile aircraft. Sarah selected her first target and maneuvered for an advantageous position. The F-22 sensors provided her with precise targeting information, and she achieved a simulated missile lock on one of the F-16s before its pilot realized he was being tracked. Bandit 2, you have been engaged. Simulate mission kill. 1 down, 3 to go. The remaining F-16 pilots reacted aggressively, converging on Sarah's position with the determination of professionals who had just lost a wingman. Sarah used the F-22's superior acceleration to extend away from the immediate threat while positioning for her next engagement. The tactical situation was developing exactly as she had hoped. By eliminating one opponent early, she had forced the remaining pilots to become more aggressive, which created opportunities for someone skilled enough to exploit them. Sarah selected her second target and executed a high-speed climbing turn that brought her into firing position on another F-16. The enemy pilot attempted defensive maneuvering, but the F-22's advanced sensors maintained lock through the evasive action. Bandit 4, you have been engaged. Simulate mission kill. 2 down, 2 to go, and the target was now only 10 miles away. The remaining F-16 pilots coordinated their final intercept attempt with desperate precision. They knew that allowing the F-22 to reach its target would mean failure of their mission, and they positioned themselves to block any possible approach route. Sarah studied the tactical display and made a decision that would have seemed impossible to most pilots. Instead of trying to avoid the remaining F-16s, she would fly directly between them at high speed, using their positioning against them. Control! Phantom 1 beginning target approach. Sarah descended to minimum altitude and accelerated toward the target area at maximum speed. The 2 remaining F-16s detected her approach and maneuvered to intercept, but their positioning prevented them from supporting each other effectively. As the first F-16 entered firing range, Sarah executed a violent defensive maneuver that brought her briefly into range of the second aircraft. Instead of continuing evasive action, she reversed direction and achieved a firing solution on the second F-16 before its pilot could react. Bandit 3, you have been engaged. Simulate mission kill. The final F-16 pilot found himself alone against an opponent who had just demonstrated capabilities beyond anything he had expected. His radio transmission betrayed frustration and grudging respect. Control, Bandit 1. That Raptor pilot is something else. I've never seen anyone fly like that. Sarah lined up on the target and delivered her simulated ordnance with precision timing. The mission was complete, and she had defeated 4 experienced opponents without taking a single hit. Control, Phantom 1. Target destroyed, mission complete, returning to base. The flight back to Tyndall gave Sarah time to process what had just happened. She had returned to the cockpit after 2 years away and performed at a level that exceeded even her own expectations. The F-22 had responded to her commands like an extension of her own will, and she had rediscovered the joy of flight that had been lost in the aftermath of her emergency over Afghanistan. Landing back at base, Sarah taxied to the parking area where a crowd had gathered to witness her return. Colonel Webb was there, along with General Hawkins and what appeared to be half the personnel on the base. The looks on their faces suggested that word of her performance had already spread through the operations center. As she shut down the engines and opened the canopy, Sarah could hear applause from the ground crew. Technical Sergeant Martinez was grinning broadly as she approached the aircraft. "Ma'am, I've been working on F-22s for 8 years, and I've never seen anyone fly one like that." "Where did you learn to fly like that?" Sarah removed her helmet and climbed down from the cockpit, her legs feeling slightly unsteady after the adrenaline of aerial combat. "Practice, Sergeant. Lots and lots of practice." General Hawkins approached with an expression of professional satisfaction mixed with obvious curiosity. "Captain Chen, that was an extraordinary demonstration of pilot skill and aircraft capability. I think it's safe to say you've answered any questions about the 325th's readiness." Colonel Webb stepped forward, still appearing somewhat stunned by the revelation of Sarah's hidden capabilities. "Chen, we need to talk about your assignment. Clearly you belong in a cockpit rather than behind a logistics desk." Sarah considered her response carefully. The past few hours had reminded her why she had loved flying. But they had also reminded her of the pressures and dangers that came with being a combat pilot. The choice between safety and excitement, between hiding and excelling, was hers to make. "Sir, I'd like to request return to flight status, effective immediately." The smile that crossed Colonel Webb's face was the first genuine expression of happiness Sarah had seen from him in the 2 years they had worked together. "Request approved, Captain. Welcome back to the flying business." As the crowd dispersed and normal base operations resumed, Sarah remained by her aircraft for a few extra minutes. The F-22 sat silently in the Florida sunshine, its mission complete and its pilot's secret finally revealed. For years, she had hidden her exceptional abilities behind a clipboard and a logistics coordinator's uniform. Now everyone knew the truth. Sarah Chen wasn't just qualified to fly the F-22 Raptor. She was one of the most skilled pilots ever to strap into the cockpit of America's most advanced fighter aircraft. They had never suspected she was an ace, but a critical situation had called her to the F-22, and she had proven that some capabilities can be hidden, but never truly lost. The woman who had spent 2 years coordinating fuel schedules and managing maintenance reports was gone forever. In her place stood Captain Sarah Chen, F-22 pilot, ready to take her place among the elite aviators of the United States Air Force. The sky was calling, and this time she was ready to answer.